I knew something was wrong the second I turned onto my driveway. The sun was sinking low behind the hills, casting long shadows over my land, but I didn't need daylight to see it. The wreckage of my solar panels was unmistakable. Glass shards glittered across the gravel like crushed ice. Wires, once neatly arranged, now curled and snapped in twisted knots. A pit formed in my stomach. This wasn't an accident. Someone had destroyed them deliberately. I killed the truck's engine and swung the door open, my boots crunching against the broken glass as I stepped out. My solar setup hadn't just been expensive, it was my independence. Out here, on the edge of town, I'd built my home to be self-sufficient. No reliance on the grid, no need for city utilities. Just me, my land, and the power of the sun. Until now. Then I saw her. A woman stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at her lips. She was dressed in a pale pink sweater set, the kind of pastel armor that suburban despots wore like a uniform. A chunky gold bracelet clinked against her wrist as she tapped one manicured nail against her forearm, like she was waiting for me to say something. I knew who she was before she even opened her mouth. Cynthia Hollingsworth, HOA president, self-appointed, queen of this neighborhood, and the single most insufferable human being I'd ever had the displeasure of dealing with. I took a slow breath, shoving down the immediate surge of anger as I met her gaze. "Did you do this?" Cynthia smiled wider, her teeth flashing in the dimming light. "That's an awfully accusatory tone, Mr. Walker." "I'll take that as a yes." She let out a light, condescending chuckle. "It was a necessary correction. Your solar panels were a violation of HOA guidelines, unsightly, disruptive to the aesthetic harmony of the community." I clenched. My jaw. They were on my property, and they were legal. "Oh, I'm afraid not." She pulled a neatly folded piece of paper from her purse and extended it like a royal decree. "The HOA board recently voted on an amendment. Solar panels must conform to specific visibility guidelines. Yours did not." I snatched the paper from her hand and skimmed it. Sure enough, the new rule had been added. Dated yesterday. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about power, control. Cynthia had been making life hell for residents ever since she'd weaseled her way into the HOA presidency. But this was next level. "You do realize destruction of property is illegal, right?" I said, my voice tight. "I could press charges." She let out a theatrical sigh. "Oh, Mr. Walker, I checked with the HOA's legal counsel. You signed an agreement when you moved in. This land, though it may feel like yours, falls under the governance of the Homeowners Association. The board determined that your panels were in violation. We had them removed accordingly." "Removed?" I gestured at the wreckage. "This doesn't look like a removal. It looks like a damn attack." Cynthia raised a brow, unconcerned. "An unfortunate consequence of non-compliance. Maybe next time you'll follow the rules." The rage in my chest burned white hot, but I didn't let it show. Not yet. Instead, I forced myself to smile. "We'll see about that." Cynthia's expression flickered, just for a second. A crack in the mask. She was used to people bending, to residents backing down, swallowing her decisions without question. She wasn't expecting a fight, but she was about to get one. The next morning, I drove into town to talk to a lawyer. He confirmed what I already suspected. Cynthia had bent the rules in her favor, but legally, she was on thin ice. The HOA had no right to destroy my property outright, but fighting them in court would be a slow, uphill battle. I needed leverage, something to tip the scales. I spent the rest of the day digging through HOA bylaws, city ordinances, anything I could use. And then, late that night, I found it. A single overlooked clause buried in the property records, a detail so small, so insignificant that no one, not even Cynthia, had bothered to notice. I owned the power grid. Well, not the entire grid, but the transformer that supplied power to the HOA-controlled section of the neighborhood? That was installed on my land. And when I'd upgraded my solar system last year, I'd integrated a personal backup system making me the primary provider for that transformer, which meant I had the ability to cut power to the entire HOA. A slow smile spread across my face. Cynthia thought she was untouchable. She had no idea just how much control I really had. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. Normally, I wouldn't bother attending, but this time, I wouldn't miss it for the world. I arrived early, slipping into the back of the room unnoticed. The place was packed. Dozens of homeowners, some flipping through paperwork, others whispering among themselves. Cynthia stood at the front, basking in the attention, her hands clasped like a benevolent queen addressing her subjects. And as you all know, maintaining the integrity of our community is paramount, she was saying, her voice dripping with self-importance. We cannot allow individuals to disregard HOA policies, no matter how inconvenient they may find them. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, some nodding, some hesitant. I spotted a few residents exchanging uneasy glances, people who'd likely been on the receiving end of Cynthia's overreach before. She continued, which brings me to the issue of non-compliance. We must ensure that all residents... I flipped the switch. The room plunged into darkness. Gasps rang out. A few people fumbled with their phones, casting eerie blue light across startled faces. Cynthia's voice cut through the confusion. Everyone, stay calm! I'm sure it's just a minor... I stepped forward. Oh, I wouldn't be so sure about that, Madam President. Silence. All heads turned toward me. Cynthia's silhouette stiffened in the dim glow of cell phone screens. Took my time letting the tension settle, then said, looks like the HOA has a power problem. Cynthia's voice was tight. Mr. Walker, this is highly inappropriate. Inappropriate? I feigned surprise. I don't know, Cynthia. You seemed pretty confident about your power just a few days ago. But here's the thing. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough to make everyone lean in. You don't have any. For the first time, Cynthia looked uncertain. I smiled. And I can prove it. The glow of cell phone screens cast eerie shadows across the room, illuminating faces twisted with confusion and unease. Murmurs spread through the crowd, hushed whispers of what just happened. And is the whole neighborhood out? Cynthia's spine stiffened. Even in the dim light, I saw the way her lips pressed into a thin, taut line. This is nothing but a temporary outage, she said, her voice edged with irritation. I'll notify the power company immediately. I let out a low chuckle. Oh, Cynthia. I shook my head. You still don't get it, do you? She shot me a glare. Mr. Walker, if you think you can disrupt this meeting with some childish stunt... It's not a stunt, I interrupted, stepping forward. This isn't a citywide outage. This is your outage, the HOA's, every single house in this neighborhood that falls under your little domain. Poof. No power. Gasps. Someone near the front flicked on their flashlight and aimed it at me. The sudden brightness stung, but I didn't look away from Cynthia. A man's voice, low, confused, rose from the crowd. Wait, you're saying only HOA houses lost power? That's exactly what I'm saying. I let my words settle, let the realization seep into the room like a slow poison. More whispers. Someone tested the clubhouse light switch. Nothing. Woman spoke up, sharp with suspicion. Cynthia, what's he talking about? Cynthia's nostrils flared. This is ridiculous, she snapped. The HOA has nothing to do with the power grid. Actually, I drawled, that's where you're wrong. I pulled a folded document from my back pocket and held it up. See, I did a little digging after you illegally destroyed my solar panels. Turns out the transformer that supplies power to this side of the neighborhood? I paused, savoring the moment. It's on my property, and when I upgraded my solar system last year, I became the primary provider for that transformer, which means I spread my hands wide. I control the power. Silence. Heavy. Unsettling. Then, an eruption of voices. What the hell? Is that even legal? You mean he owns our power? Cynthia's face darkened, her composure slipping. This is a lie, she hissed, her voice cutting through the chaos. He's bluffing. Am I? I gestured toward the useless light fixtures overhead. Funny thing about bluffs, Cynthia. They tend to fall apart when the proof is staring you right in the face. More murmurs. Confusion twisted into anger. Not at me. At her. I could see the shift happening, the same way a storm brews on the horizon, slow at first, then all at once. Cynthia clenched her fists. "This is temporary," she declared, voice tightening. "We'll have the power company resolve. This within the hour." I let out a low chuckle. "Oh, Cynthia. You still don't get it, do you?" I leaned forward, voice calm but deliberate. "The power company can't help you, because you don't own this grid. I do." A man near the back stood, his expression pinched with disbelief. "You mean to tell us he can shut off our power whenever he wants?" I turned to face the crowd, letting them see the truth for themselves. I could, but I wouldn't. I didn't. "Do this to punish you." I turned back to Cynthia. "I did this to make a point." She crossed her arms, regaining some of her composure. "Oh, and what point would that be, exactly? That you're not untouchable." That struck a nerve. I saw the way her breath hitched, the briefest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, before she masked it with forced indignation. "You think this little stunt changes anything?" she sneered. "You think you've won? I think you've made a lot of enemies tonight." I glanced around the room. Homeowners who had once sat quietly, afraid to challenge her, were now restless, uneasy, realizing that the woman they'd let rule over them had no actual power when it mattered most. But I wasn't done yet. I pulled another paper from my pocket and unfolded it slowly, deliberately. "I'm giving you a choice, Cynthia." Her chin lifted. "A choice?" I nodded. "Either you personally pay to replace every last solar panel you had destroyed, or—" I trailed off, tilting my head. "Or what? Or this blackout?" I gestured to the darkened room. "It stays." The murmurs turned into outright exclamations. "You can't do that," someone shouted. "You can't just cut off power." I held up a hand for silence, my gaze never leaving Cynthia's. "I don't want to, but if I have to, I will." Cynthia's lips parted, but no words came out. I saw it now, the hesitation, the first crack in her unshakable confidence. She glanced around, searching for support, but her allies were few and far between. Even the ones who normally would have sided with her looked uncertain now, realizing that Cynthia had overplayed her hand. But she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter, but no less venomous. "You think you can blackmail me?" "I think I'm giving you an opportunity to do the right thing." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You destroyed my property because you thought you could get away with it. But now you know the truth. You can't." She exhaled sharply through her nose. "I don't negotiate with bullies," I chuckled. "That's funny, because that's exactly what you are." She flinched, just slightly. Then suddenly, she turned to the crowd, throwing her hands up dramatically. "Everyone, listen to me. This man is trying to extort us. He's using his control over the power to hold us hostage." A ripple of uncertainty spread through the room. I could see it, the hesitation, the worry. Cynthia saw it too, and she seized the moment. "This is an attack on our community," she declared. "I will not be threatened by some lone wolf who thinks he can disrupt the order we've worked so hard to maintain." I clenched my jaw. She was slippery. I'd give her that. Even now, backed into a corner, she was looking for a way out. And if I let her turn this narrative in her favor, she would find one. No. I couldn't let her regain control. I needed something bigger. Something she couldn't weasel her way out of. And then, just like that, I knew exactly what to do. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You want to talk about threats, Cynthia?" I said, keeping my voice measured. "Then let's talk about real threats." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope I had been saving. I tossed it onto the table in front of her. It slid across the wood, stopping just before her perfectly manicured fingers. She stared at it, then up at me. "What is this?" I crossed my arms. "Open it." Her fingers trembled, just slightly, as she reached for the envelope. She tore it open, her face drained of color. I smirked. Now I had her. The envelope trembled slightly in Cynthia's grip, the papers inside rustling as she pulled them out. The room was silent, save for the distant hum of phone screens still lighting desperate faces, waiting for an explanation. Cynthia's eyes darted over the first page. She blinked. Her lips parted slightly as if forming a protest, but no words came out. I watched the moment hit her in slow motion, the way her shoulders tensed, the way she swallowed hard just once, the way her fingers gripped the edges of the papers so tightly I thought they might tear. Then she caught herself. Her expression hardened. She let out a sharp breath through her nose and raised her chin, forcing a scoff. "This," she said, shaking. "The paper for emphasis is nothing but a desperate attempt to intimidate me." I tilted my head. Is it? I knew what she was looking at. I had spent hours digging, combing through records, searching for something, anything, to use against her. And when I found it, buried under years of bureaucratic paperwork, I knew I had struck gold. It was a financial report, a trail of misallocated HOA funds, and it all led back to Cynthia. She tried to act unaffected, but I saw the twitch in her brow, the slight clench of her jaw. I turned to the room, making sure I had their full attention. See, I started wondering, how exactly does Cynthia enforce all these fines and fees? Where does all that money go? I gestured to the paper in her hands. Turns out the answer is pretty damn interesting. A murmur rippled through the room. I took a step closer to her. This is a record of every financial transaction the HOA has made under your leadership. And would you look at that? Thousands of dollars in fines collected for so-called violations. I turned to the crowd. Anybody here ever get hit with a ridiculous fine? Hands shot up. Cynthia's mask didn't slip, but I could see the tightness in her frame, the way she was gripping those papers like a lifeline. I continued, voice even. And yet, none of that money went to community projects. No new landscaping, no road maintenance, no improvements to common areas. I turned to face her again. But you did just get a brand new deck built, didn't you, Cynthia? The room erupted. Shouts of outrage. People turning to each other, demanding answers. Are you serious? She charged me $500 for leaving my trash cans out an hour late. I had to replace my mailbox to meet her aesthetic standards. She shut down my Christmas lights display, said it wasn't within HOA compliance. But she installed an entire hot tub? Cynthia took a step back. This is all circumstantial. Is it? I arched a brow. Because this, I tapped the papers, says otherwise. She looked to her board members for backup. A few of them shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. One of them, a balding man in a navy blazer, actually took a step away from her. Panic flickered behind her eyes. She turned back to me, trying to regain control. You have no proof of wrongdoing, she said, voice sharp. This is nothing more than a smear campaign. I pulled another sheet from my pocket, a photocopy of an HOA check, signed by Cynthia, made out to a contractor, for work done on her own home. I let the silence stretch. A slow, boiling kind of anger settled over the room. She was trapped, and she knew it. But Cynthia Hollingsworth didn't go down without a fight. She straightened, regaining that false air of superiority. This is an outrageous violation of my privacy. How dare you obtain financial records without permission? I am the HOA president. I cut her off. Not anymore. That did it. For the first time, real fear flashed across her face, and then, almost hilariously, she laughed. It was a brittle, forced sound. You don't have the authority to remove me. No, I agreed. But they do. I turned to the crowd. She's been stealing from you, using your money for her own gain, destroying property, extorting. Homeowners, do you really want her representing you? The energy in the room shifted. Someone called out, I motion to vote for her removal. Cynthia's head snapped in the direction of the voice. You can't do that, another voice. Seconded. No, this meeting is not an official session for voting. A third voice rang out. All in favor of removing Cynthia Hollingsworth as HOA president? Aye. A chorus of voices. Strong. Angry. The color drained from Cynthia's face all over again. She spun toward her board. You can't let them do this! The balding man who had once stood firmly in her shadow cleared his throat. The motion has been made." He hesitated, then added almost apologetically, It stands." Silence. Cynthia's chest rose and fell rapidly. Her fingers trembled. Her gaze darted around the room, wild and desperate, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. And then she did what I least expected. She smiled. Not a real smile. A dangerous one. She exhaled sharply through her nose, shaking her head. Then, in a voice so low only I could hear, she whispered, "You think this is over?" The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Then she turned to the crowd, plastering on that same artificial smile. "Well," she said, her voice suddenly too smooth, too controlled, "I see where this is going." She tucked the financial documents under her arm like they meant nothing. "It appears my time here is coming to an end," a few people muttered in confusion. I narrowed my eyes. "What are you playing at?" Her smile widened. She turned toward the clubhouse exit, walked toward the door. Then, just before stepping outside, she stopped, glanced back at me over her shoulder, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let's see how long this neighborhood lasts without me." Then she was gone. The room buzzed with energy. Some people were still processing what had happened. Others were talking about what came next. But me? I was watching the door. Because something wasn't right. Cynthia had lost everything. Power, control. And yet she hadn't fought. She had given up too easily. Which meant she had something else planned, and whatever it was coming. The room buzzed with energy, residents still reeling from the sudden collapse of Cynthia's rule. But my mind was elsewhere. My gut twisted with unease. Cynthia didn't lose. Not like that. Not without burning something to the ground on her way out. I turned toward the exit, my pulse quickening. I needed to get home. I pushed past the murmuring crowd and stepped outside. The night was thick, the air still warm from the day's sun. My truck sat in the parking lot, waiting, but something in the distance made me pause, a faint flickering glow, coming from my land. A cold dread settled in my chest. No, I bolted. The drive back was a blur, my tires kicking up dust as I raced down the road. By the time I crested the final hill, my fears were confirmed. Fire. Orange flames licked at the edges of my property, creeping dangerously close to where my new solar panels should have been. Except they weren't there. They were toppled, shattered, their glass reflecting the inferno. I slammed the truck into park and leapt out, my boots pounding against dry earth. The fire wasn't a wildfire. It was too controlled, too deliberately placed. Small blazes set in precise locations, all leading toward my equipment, my power source, my leverage. Cynthia had made her move. I sprinted for my hose, my heart hammering, but as I reached for it, click, the unmistakable sound of a lighter flicking open. I turned sharply. Cynthia stood there, just beyond the flames, holding a long-stemmed lighter. Her face was eerily calm, the orange glow illuminating her features like something out of a nightmare. "You really should have let things be, Mr. Walker," she mused, her tone almost bored. "You thought you could humiliate me in front of my community," she tisked. "That was a mistake." My fists clenched. "You set fire to my land." Her lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, please. A little fire never hurt anyone." "But—" She flicked the lighter closed and gave a casual shrug. "A full-on power failure? Now that could really ruin someone's life." It hit me. She wasn't just destroying my solar panels. She was trying to sabotage the power grid. If she burned the main transformer, the one I controlled, the entire neighborhood would go dark. Permanent damage, thousands in repairs, a nightmare of permits, legal battles, insurance, claims. She wasn't just lashing out. She was making sure no one walked away from this unscathed. I took a step toward her, but she stepped back, keeping the flames between us. Her eyes gleamed. "I've always been so good at cleaning up messes, you know. And now, well..." She spread her arms. "No HOA, no Walker, just a community begging for order." "You're insane," I growled. "Am I?" She tilted her head, watching as the fire climbed higher. Or am I just the only one willing to do what needs to be done? The flames cracked, sparks popping into the air. I had to stop this. I scanned my land, searching for anything to cut this short. My water reserves were too far back. No time for hoses, no time for reason. Then I spotted it. My old generator. It was still hooked up to the secondary system, meant as an emergency backup. But more importantly, it had one crucial feature: a remote power surge. I reached for my pocket. Cynthia was still gloating, lost in her own victory. See? You're not the only one who knows how to manipulate power, Walker, she continued. The difference is, I don't ask for control. I take it. I let her talk. I pulled out my phone, and I activated the surge. A deep mechanical hum filled the air. Cynthia frowned. What? A shockwave of light burst from the transformer behind her. A surge of power so strong it momentarily blinded both of us. Then, boom. The breaker exploded, cutting off every ounce of current flowing to the HOA district. The fire, deprived of its electrical fuel source, sputtered in place. But the real masterpiece? Cynthia's own home, her pristine, newly remodeled temple of power, was directly wired into the system. And now it was completely fried. Lights out, appliances dead, security systems gone. The woman who ruled through control now had nothing. Cynthia staggered back, her eyes wide. You wanted a blackout, Cynthia. I stepped toward her. Well, now you have one. The sound of sirens pierced the night air. The neighbors had seen the fire, had called the authorities. Cynthia turned, desperate, searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the flames were already dying. The damage was minimal: scorched earth, shattered panels, but nothing I couldn't rebuild. Cynthia, on the other hand, she was done. The police questioned me, then her. And when the evidence of arson was brought up, well, let's just say she didn't have that smug look anymore. She was taken away in the back of a squad car. And for the first time since she had clawed her way into power, Cynthia Hollingsworth had no control. The neighborhood changed after that. With Cynthia gone, the HOA crumbled. People started realizing they didn't need some bureaucratic dictator breathing down their necks, so they voted. They dissolved the HOA. No more petty fines, no more ridiculous rules, no more power-hungry tyrants. I rebuilt my solar array, bigger, stronger. Cynthia had tried to take my independence, so I made damn sure no one would ever touch it again. And then, when the work was done, I did something the old HOA never would have allowed. I threw a barbecue. The whole neighborhood showed up. People who had once been too afraid to even speak against Cynthia were now laughing, drinking, eating under the glow of the very power she had tried to destroy. And as I stood there, beer in hand, watching the community finally come together on their own terms, I realized something. Cynthia had spent years making people afraid, convincing them they needed her to keep order. But the second she was gone, they were better off without her. That was the final nail in her coffin. She hadn't just lost. She had made herself irrelevant. And that was the greatest defeat of all.